Hey, this episode of This Is a Thing is part of Suptember 2022. Both the Cinemasters and Cinemasters channels are focusing on superhero content for the entire month of September, so don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the second episode of This Is a Thing happening later this month. And while you're at it, check out the Cinemasters channel for more superhero-related content. Suptember is happening all month long on both channels. And now, to the show. So Luke Cage is a thing. Before the Netflix show, not many people knew about Luke Cage, and to be honest, I still think that's kind of the case. But for me, Luke Cage was what really got me into the MCU. I don't really make an effort to hide the fact that I'm not super into superhero movies. There are so many of them now, and they've become less of a genre and more of a mode of storytelling. Kind of like how comedy as a genre has fallen to the wayside, and any movie can have humor in it, from horror to period dramas, for better or for worse. Superheroes are kind of the same. We have superheroes in comedies with Thor Ragnarok, and we have superheroes in horror in Multiverse of Madness and New Mutants, for better or for worse. I watched all the Netflix Marvel shows in reverse order, starting with Iron Fist, and for those wondering why I did this, I'm a huge Iron Fist fan. And for those wondering why I stuck with it after that, well, maybe I'm a glutton for punishment. But after Iron Fist, I started Luke Cage, and this show just hits different. I remember watching the show a few months after it first hit Netflix in 2017, and unlike Iron Fist, I was immediately struck by the nuanced and superb storytelling. It's not just the story of one man, but of a whole community and the complex internal and external struggles of a whole diaspora, or diaspora, however you pronounce that. I wanted to watch the villains succeed just as much as the heroes. Yeah, we'll get to the Cottonmouth thing. Like Captain America Winter Soldier, which I talked about last year, Luke Cage isn't just about a man in a mask, or a hoodie, as the case may be, because superheroes mean something, and when creators understand that, they can make stories about the nature of what those heroes represent and what their actions represent. But unlike Captain America, Luke Cage as a show was more grounded. In Winter Soldier, Cap is the representation of America and American ideals and morality being eroded by the surveillance state and corruption. And you can hear more about my thoughts on that on last year's episode. Luke Cage is a representation of the African American or Black communities in the United States, and his story is deliberately small scale in order to focus on this. Luke doesn't deal with alien invasions or genocidal robots or computerized Nazi coups d'etats. Luke's struggles are less allegorical, as a lot of the conflicts he's dealing with are directly related to the problems of systemic and systematic racism in the United States. And I think that this in-your-face approach is what made Luke Cage the most important of the Netflix Marvel shows. Not necessarily the best, that would probably be Daredevil or the first season of Jessica Jones, but certainly the most important. And with Daredevil's recent inclusion in the wider MCU, I think there's no better time to reintroduce Luke Cage because of the social discourse around the Black Lives Matter movement and the nature of policing and violence towards Black people in the States and all over the world. Luke Cage, the man and the show, was unafraid to get into the nitty-gritty and nuances of the Black community through its depiction of its heroes, its villains, the identity of Harlem as a community, and the way the show deals with media both inside and outside its narrative. I'm going to do this with a focus on Luke as a superhero and as a piece of art because I'm a philosopher and a media critic, and I'm not a sociologist, nor am I a Black person. So this episode is about the meaning of Luke Cage as an iconic hero, and how the show functions as a piece of art, what it's trying to do with the superhero story, and why I think this show really needs to return. And so today, I want to talk about Luke Cage. In the 1970s, a successful film genre emerged known as blaxploitation, where famous characters were replaced or stories were retold with Black characters as archetypes or caricatures of what the world saw as Black culture. In this time, two white dudes decided that they could cash in on this and do the same thing, but for comics. In 1972, they debuted their new character, and while it was still hugely problematic, Luke Cage, Hero for Hire, was unique in that, unlike most heroes, he debuted in a comic of his very own. Although he was not the first Black superhero, he was the first to be the titular character of his own series. That's a big deal. But as blaxploitation's popularity faded, Luke's appeal also waned, because he was basically a stereotype.
You look like a damn fool.
In order to keep his popularity up, Cage was paired with the semi-popular Iron Fist and given the name Power Man.
Power Man and Iron Fist. It's got a ring to it. That's going on a t-shirt for real.
The two have continued to work together in some form or another since then as Power Man and Iron Fist, or as Heroes for Hire. While never one of Marvel's biggest names, Luke has always maintained some level of popularity, whether it be in his own series or during a team-up. Luke has worked with the Defenders, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man on many occasions, and was for a brief time a central part of the Avengers and their de facto leader. Like many heroes, Cage's identity and meaning have changed throughout the ages. His origins in Blaxploitation painted him as a stereotypical black character that was popular for the time. His pairing with Iron Fist forced Luke's personality to become more grounded, as Iron Fist was an extra-dimensional hero who was unfamiliar with the ways of Earth. Luke became more of the straight man to Danny's antics. Throughout the later decades, Cage lost all of his ties to the Blaxploitation character that he was born from and became a much more realized comic book hero with his own personalized villains and lore. In 2013, Netflix began a deal with Disney and Marvel to create a series of shows that would be loosely connected to the MCU. These shows would eventually become Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Iron Fist, and of course, Luke Cage. Luke Cage's history as a show is actually a bit more involved than the rest of its television peers, as the rights for Luke Cage on screen were not owned by Marvel, but by Columbia, which had been attempting to create a movie adaptation since something like 2003. But the rights were returned to Marvel, now owned by Disney, and conceptualized as a series. The show was created and run by Chio Hodari Coker, who wanted to use Luke Cage as a show that examined the complexities of Harlem. Coker referenced the show The Wire and what it did for Baltimore as the inspiration for how he wanted to explore Harlem's social landscape. Disney was on board for this and actually fast-tracked the show to be released before Iron Fist, especially after the hugely positive reception of Mike Colter's casting and portrayal in Jessica Jones. The first season was released in 2017, and the first 7 episodes were critically acclaimed. Yeah, we'll get to the Cottonmouth thing. In 2018, the second season was released, and although it was not praised as highly, both seasons were well received and respected, and the second season did some amazing things to set up further storylines. But at that time, all of the Netflix shows left audiences a little confused as to whether or not they were actually a part of the MCU. This turned out not really to be a problem, as all 5 Netflix shows were cancelled, leaving fans asking questions about the fate of the 5 heroes. Not just within the universe, or whether or not they were a part of it, but whether we would ever see these versions again. The cancellation was done in order to prepare for the eventual launch of Disney's own streaming service about a year later. Disney didn't want to be creating content for Netflix as the competitor for Disney+. However, this did not stop fans from speculating about the inclusion or eventual integration of those heroes into the MCU. In 2022, Disney outright confirmed the inclusion of Charlie Cox as Matt Murdock as part of the MCU. The shows have now been moved over to Disney+, and a Daredevil TV show has been announced for 2023. However, a few questions have remained unanswered. Despite having Charlie Cox return to the role, there's been no confirmation as to whether this is the same Daredevil as before. And if it is, it begs the question, will the rest of the Netflix heroes, including Luke Cage, be returning as well? If you haven't seen Luke Cage, then you probably should, because both of its seasons are incredible and nuanced and important explorations of black culture in the media, but also a great superhero show. And these things are why I want to talk about it, and context matters, so here's your spoiler warning. After the events of Jessica Jones, Luke Cage finds himself working in Pop's barbershop in Harlem. Wanting to be left to his own devices, Luke does very little with his superpowers, much to the chagrin of Pop, who knows about them but keeps them quiet at Luke's request.
You should be out there helping people, that's all. Like them other fellas downtown.
When some of the local kids start to get into trouble and 2 of them wind up dead, Pop asks Luke to investigate, and Luke winds up in the middle of a divided community involving the notorious crime lord Cornell Cottonmouth Stokes, who is running drugs and guns out of the Crispus Attucks Center in order to fund the political campaign of his cousin, Mariah Stokes.
Reflecting the change is going to keep Harlem black, and us in the green.
You focus on the black, I'll protect our green.
When Harlem detective Misty Knight gets involved, she suspects that Luke may know more than he lets on, but Luke isn't sure that he can trust her. To make matters worse, a bad dude named Shades shows up, pushing souped-up hardware from a dude named Diamondback. Hardware that eventually winds up in the wrong hands and has Pop killed in his own barbershop. Eventually, Luke and Misty trust each other, but the ever-changing social landscape in Harlem don't make the pair's work any easier. Misty's partner turns out to be crooked, and Mariah straight up murders Cottonmouth and then blames it on Luke. Yeah, we'll come back to the Cottonmouth thing. Then Diamondback himself shows up, turns out to be Luke's brother, and shoots Luke with a specialized round. We then find out that Luke was imprisoned for a crime he never committed and was subjected to violent underground fights and experimental tests. The doctor that gave Luke his powers helps save his life, and Luke returns to Harlem to defeat Diamondback, clearing his name and restoring the uneasy peace to Harlem. Season 2 opens up with the arrival of John McIver, or Bushmaster, who holds a grudge after the Stokes family murdered and stole from his family. Although Luke doesn't like Mariah Stokes, he doesn't agree with Bushmaster's methods. With Mariah and Shades accumulating ever more power and Bushmaster on the warpath, Luke will have to figure out whose side he's on and how he wants to proceed. But with his friends and family leaving for personal reasons, Luke is left with only Misty to help him out. And Danny for one episode. Luke manages to defeat Bushmaster and eventually Mariah, who winds up dying. But in her last act of revenge, she leaves her club, Harlem's Paradise, to Luke, anticipating that he will not be able to resist its charms.
But in the end, it will change him.
The season then ends with Luke set up at the center of a very dubious organization and in a bit of a morally questionable position. But without a third season, there's no way of knowing what will happen next. The only other place that Luke popped up was in the final season of Jessica Jones, where Luke convinces Jessica that taking down her sister is the right thing to do. And he also mentions,
If I ever go too far, I hope that someone gives enough of a shit about me to take me down.
which, like, you know, based on where his show ended, that would have been a crazy showdown. One that will likely never happen. Luke Cage as a hero in modern day is fascinating. The show Luke Cage and the character within the show differ a bit from their comic counterparts. Not so much in personality, which was largely unchanged, but in the implication of Luke's abilities. Coker understood that he had the opportunity to say something with Luke. A character that is a large black man in the center of his own show is a big deal, and a large part of why the show's direction was chosen is because not only is Luke super strong, but his skin is like armor and impervious to most conventional weapons. That means that Luke is bulletproof. Now, we've seen Superman and others like him, so this isn't new, but based on what's happening in the United States around black men being shot and killed through gang violence and police brutality, it's Luke's inability to be harmed by bullets that make a huge statement.
I guess you guys haven't heard about me, have you?
I'm actually a little surprised the show wasn't called Bulletproof, just to drive this home. Also, because I think Bulletproof is a bitchin' name for a show. Luke in the comics has been known for his strength, and that comes into play in the show quite a lot, but the larger focus on Luke is his bulletproof quality.
Bulletproof always gonna come second to being black.
This line is profound because it comes with the understanding that Luke's bulletproof quality is important as a black man, but in America, everything including his superpowers comes secondary to his blackness, which is a great way to use a character's exceptionality to remind viewers of the way that people of color are labeled despite their accomplishments. Luke's impenetrable skin in the show is shown far more often than his super strength. This is done purposefully because Luke as a character is a reluctant hero.
I ain't no hero.
That's a great slogan. I ain't no hero, pay me. You can market that shit.
Luke is reluctant to do anything but get on with his own life. And Luke's skin isn't really a power he has to activate. And it doesn't show up to cover his body. He's just always bulletproof. He requires no action in order to benefit from it. Luke doesn't have bulletproof skin, he is bulletproof all the time. This is important because, like Luke's actions, he isn't reacting or actively engaging in the violence around him, but passively deflecting it. When Luke does make active maneuvers, they're often to protect others or usually calculated acts of violence meant to neutralize or intimidate his adversaries in an attempt to avoid further violence.
It's here. It's all around you. If you respect yourself enough to take a look.
At what?
Our legacy.
Don't get me wrong, when there's no other option, Luke throws down and it's awesome to watch, but Luke is depicted as having violence done to him rather than doing violence to others. And this matters because the way the media portrays black men is as overwhelmingly violent. But unlike the Punisher, who I talked about last year as being a hero of the American monomyth who is steeped in violence, Luke is never unnecessarily violent and never brutal. What's more is that Luke is a very large and intimidating person, but his speech and demeanor are calm. Luke has a lot of self-awareness, and he knows that his strength and abilities are seen differently by people because of the color of his skin. When he gets angry, it's usually a quiet, simmering anger that he then channels.
Yo, you know what? I'm about sick and tired of
What? You sick and tired of what?
This is great when he's paired with Danny, who is young and impulsive. Luke is always the voice of reason when Danny gets carried away, and that dynamic works. When the world is falling apart and people are losing their heads, Luke keeps things from collapsing with both his strength and his demeanor, and this is an overwhelmingly positive depiction of a black man. And I didn't even mention the fact that he's so absolutely effortlessly cool.
You're fired.
No, I'm not. I quit before I walked in.
No superhero story is complete without a good villain or villains, and Luke Cage has a few of them, and yeah, we'll get to the Cottonmouth thing. Luke's villains are great because, like him, they also changed for the show. First and foremost, I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of Luke's villains are named after snakes. Cottonmouth, Diamondback, and Bushmaster are all snakes, and this has a lot to do with the religious nature of Luke Cage as a show and Luke's relationship with religion and the African American church community at large. I think it would have been very interesting to see Matt Murdock and Luke talk religion. I'm disappointed they didn't interact more on the whole, actually. But back to the villains. In the show, Luke has 4 major villains: Cottonmouth, Diamondback, Mariah, and then Bushmaster. Each of them are motivated for different reasons and represent very different things. Cottonmouth, or Cornell Stokes, is the quintessential criminal element, and yet he's far more complicated than that. Through him, we see that there are systematic and generational reasons why he came to be this way. Like Luke, Cottonmouth has layers and is arguably an even more interesting character than Luke, and he sits right up there with Kilgrave and Kingpin, and yet he is easily the most sympathetic of those 3. Which is important because Cottonmouth has power and is a bad dude, but he's also a victim of Harlem's dark side, and he's also genuinely just smooth as fuck.
That's the problem with these youngsters. They want it all, but they don't want to put in the work.
Mariah, on the other hand, represents this want to integrate. As a politician, she is working on trying to make change and getting power in another way.
Politics is where the power is, Cornell.
But the implication is that the politics is the white hegemonic way of getting power, to work for and inside the literal system of oppression. She too is complicated and multifaceted, and I really hated her in season 2, which is the mark of a great villain. Diamondback is more complicated. He has a relationship to Luke, but their whole past comes out of nowhere in the middle of the season, despite the decent setup they gave him. He didn't quite have the same impact as Cottonmouth, but his backstory speaks to that religious connection that Luke has and the strange relationship with church and religion in black communities. Diamondback also has guns that bring some stakes because they can harm Luke, and as an arms dealer, he is directly responsible for a lot of the gun violence in Harlem. Bushmaster was great because not only did he have the physical abilities to defeat Luke, which in itself is interesting, but he represented a small subset of the black community as a Jamaican, because black people are not a monolith. The media likes to refer to an area like Harlem as black, but other than a description of skin color for a massive group of people, this tells us very little about their history and culture. It's far more nuanced than that. Bushmaster is not even really a bad dude, but his approach to problem solving brings violence to Harlem, and that puts him at odds with Luke despite their similar goals. He also brought back a lot of the charisma that we lost when Cottonmouth was murdered. So yeah, now we can get to the Cottonmouth thing. In episode 7 of season 1, Cottonmouth dies, and it's a really big twist, mostly because he was set up as the primary antagonist of the show, and was set up as this brilliant criminal and also a multifaceted and often empathetic character. And a lot of people noticed that after his death, the show felt a little unfocused. So why did Luke Cage shoot itself in the foot by killing off Cottonmouth? Well, they only had Mahershala Ali for 7 episodes. That's really the only reason. And while I wanted to see more of him, the fact that Mariah is the one who murders him is a huge moment for her character. She goes from corrupt politician to taking over Cottonmouth's operation, and it really works. While not nearly as charismatic as Cornell, she's now clearly capable of murder and will probably do it again. Spoilers, she's definitely gonna do it again. And this makes her unlikable, which, like I said, is a great quality in a villain. Cottonmouth's death does a lot for Mariah. I just wish they'd left Diamondback for another season and focused on Luke versus Mariah at that point. The villains and Luke himself are a great indicator of Harlem and the way the community is represented. And through Misty, we also see their relationship with the police, both the individual officers and the system itself. The point of all this is that we get to see how all the characters within the community create that community, and that Harlem is incredibly complex and dynamic. Pop's Barbershop is a great place to start, as it's a place where people gather and hang out. Barbershops in black communities do function as this kind of safe haven.
Letting them hang out, play video games, anything. It's better than what's waiting for them out there on the street.
It's also a place that is neutral no matter what's happening outside.
Because this place is Switzerland. It has to be, and you know it.
In Pops, no one is even allowed to swear.
And you could set a watch by the way that shit will play out.
And this is also indicative about the way the community interacts and is divided on particular topics. The use of particular African American vernacular words is even debated among members of the same community.
You know I despise that word.
As there are those who, like Luke, despise profanity,
Sweet Christmas.
but others who swear with no regard to the meaning and use of profanity, and sometimes as a means of taking back and reclaiming the words that have had power over them. There are many schools of thought on this topic, and the usage of particular words is not uniformly understood or appreciated. And there are more examples of why Harlem as a community is divided and unified, but the point is that the show made it feel real through its characters, through its language, and even through the use of real-world artists and celebrities. Luke Cage's relationship to the media is interesting, as it's both within and outside of the show. Within the show, there is actually a little cameo of Trish Talk, where Jessica Jones's sister talks about Luke Cage on her show as a kind of introductory snippet to the episode.
If you're just joining us, this is Trish Talk, and we are discussing the recent events that have the residents of Harlem confused and some even frightened.
It's a nice detail to tie the universe together, but it's also very telling because, as I talked about before, Luke having powers still comes second to him being black.
Bulletproof always gonna come second to being black.
The show is very aware of how Luke is viewed as a black man by the media. Part of Diamondback's plan is to frame Luke as being a cop killer, and later, the way some cops treat a young black kid has an effect on the public and their relationship to the police. And a lot of the time, the media that's within the show is connected to the outside world. One of the radio shows in the show has famous radio host Sway talking about Luke Cage. At one point, Luke exchanges sweaters with Method Man the rapper. Every episode at Harlem's Paradise, there's a new black artist or band playing. The show is acutely aware of how media and art portray black culture, and it crosses that line by having the media both inside and outside that narrative. So much so that every episode of Luke Cage is named after a song by a black artist. Outside the show, Luke's bulletproof quality was taken a step further. Obviously, they couldn't and didn't want to put Luke Cage in his Power Man suit, because why would you ever do that? But Luke's outfits almost always have yellow incorporated into them, and most notably is his iconic yellow-lined black hoodie. The hoodie is important because throughout the show it constantly gets holes in it, and the image of a black person wearing a hoodie with bullet holes in it has become a powerful one. It's iconic, not just for Luke because of the yellow, but because of the wider implication of what that calls to mind in terms of police violence. And this is why the show is very aware of its media presence. It's a celebration of black culture and art, and that includes the art against the way violence is directed at black individuals and communities. This show has the most style out of any of the Netflix Marvel shows, and easily the best soundtrack because it's aware of how Luke looks within the show and how the show looks within the context of the superhero movement. Because like the comic book, Luke Cage was the first black man in the MCU to have his own titular show, and like the character, the show is still seen as black first and then a superhero show. The fact that the Netflix shows have been largely ignored up until the return of Daredevil is upsetting, and even with Daredevil set to return, there is still no mention of any of the other heroes by Disney or within the universe. This is disappointing for a lot of fans, but I think culturally this is a missed opportunity for Luke Cage in particular. The lack of acknowledgement and downright distancing of Luke Cage the character and the show from the MCU is incredibly telling in terms of how Disney and Marvel want to handle the MCU. And yes, I know that Black Panther is a thing, and he's actually canonically one of Luke's own personal heroes, but T'Challa and Black Panther are about Afrofuturism, which is amazing, but it's not the same as Luke Cage's study of Harlem. Sam as Captain America is closer to this, and like I said last Suptember, I love the idea of Sam and what he represents as the legacy of Cap and how America should be for everyone. But Luke Cage is about what it means to live in America and focuses not on what made Luke unique in terms of his powers, but unique in terms of his character and how he used his powers to help people in his community.
You Harlem's Captain America.
The language and stories in Luke Cage were brilliantly crafted in order to be real, but Coker and the other creatives had to fight in order to be able to create that level of realism, especially in the language. They did this so that the show would be this incredible look into a small part of the world that reflected a larger identity and ideology through its use of its heroes, villains, depiction of its community, and its relationship to the media. And while the show was on Netflix and only tangentially related to the MCU, Disney could keep it at a distance and allow for this kind of storytelling. But in the wake of certain events in the United States around police violence and race, Luke Cage is exactly the kind of story that we need right now. So with Daredevil coming back, Luke Cage should have been the very next reintroduction. And yet, Disney has remained silent on the topic. Oh, Luke Cage can stay on Disney Plus, and Disney will take credit for it, but when it comes time to get their hands dirty and make a stand about the things that Luke would have stood up for and believed in, I just don't see that happening.
I laid in the cut until he stepped up, and it cost him his life too. I ain't laying back no more.
And that's exactly why Luke Cage is the hero and story that we need right now. Here are my stray thoughts. I want to reiterate one more time that I'm not a sociologist, nor do I have any experience as a person of color, so this was all done with the intention of bringing some critical thought to the art. I think there's an easy way to bring Luke into the MCU and pick up right where he left off. I would have a new crime lord introduced using the Tombstone moniker, and then have it turn out that it's Luke Cage running things out of Harlem. What a twist! And then he would have his own show with a redemption arc. Much as I would love to see Heroes for Hire show with Luke and Danny, I think that Luke getting his own show would actually be a stronger way to tackle the social issues going on right now. Cynical as this might be, I really don't think we're going to see any of the other Defenders return, except maybe the Punisher. Jessica's story felt done, Luke is too political, and Iron Fist is, well, I liked it. Hey, thanks so much for watching that episode. I always love it when I get to rip into Disney every once in a while, and that felt really good at the end there. Apparently, I'm slowly working my way through all of the Defenders, as I've already done Jessica Jones and the Punisher, so we'll see what happens next year. Maybe with Daredevil coming around. That'll give me something to talk about. Don't forget to check out our other channel, the Cinemasters, for more conversations about movies, and Suptember happening all month long on both channels. So stick around for more of This Is a Thing, the long and the short of it, and whatever else we got going on, right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.